1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcast, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode, Domestic Violence Survivor and Homeless 2, a California cohort shows what can be done. This July, VOCA, the Federal Victims of Crime Act, which funds services for people who find themselves homeless due to domestic violence, is slated to lose 45% of its funding. This episode, we address what can be done. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters.
The war on women takes many forms, but have you ever considered that at least some of its refugees might be the homeless you see on your streets? Homeless or houselessness in the U.S. has reached a crisis point. In 2022, the number of homeless individuals here reached a record high, over 500,000 people, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Look more closely, as researchers in Los Angeles recently did, and you'll find a disturbing fact. In one study, 35% of those who'd experienced homelessness had also experienced domestic violence. Now, some are calling for more gender-conscious policymaking. In Los Angeles, a unique cohort of advocates, policymakers, and survivors is laying out what that might look like. Today, we are going to meet some of them. Teniecka Drake and Yenni Rivera are survivors of domestic violence-related homelessness turned advocates. Teniecka works with Rainbow Services in LA and Yenni with LAHSA, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. Krista Colón is the Senior Director for Public Policy for the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. She has successfully advocated for over $1 million in new funding for domestic violence victim services and prevention. But as we're speaking, federal funding for crime victim services is slated to be cut by almost half, 45%, this summer, with a lot at stake. I am very happy to welcome our guests, all of you. Thanks for joining me here on Laura Flanders and Friends. Let me start with you, Krista. You deal with policy at the state level as well as the county and city. Can you just lay out the scenario and what you've learned about that link between domestic violence and homelessness?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having us today. Thank you for covering this really important topic. The link between domestic violence and homelessness is fundamental. This is a core part of domestic violence. It is a core issue facing survivors, and it's a core piece of how we respond to survivors. For domestic violence survivors, housing is a huge barrier in making that decision about whether to stay in an abusive situation or to leave. And once they've left, the ability or lack of ability to find housing can be a number one reason why they would return to an abusive situation. For survivors and for our homeless population, especially among women, domestic violence is a leading cause of their homelessness. And the domestic violence shelters serving survivors are homeless service providers, even though we don't always talk about them in that context.
Have we always studied the data from this perspective? Because it seems first, before we know we have a problem, at least at the level of policymaking, we have to be persuaded by numbers. Have we always looked at the gender breakdown and the causes for homelessness, especially among women and single people on the street?
I think there's always been some data, and certainly coming from the domestic violence perspective, we've been looking at and know this data. But at the partnership, along with partners in Los Angeles, including Rainbow Services, we co-sponsored legislation to really push farther for that. It was a bill that passed a couple years ago, SB 914 by Senator Susan Rubio, that was designed to really fundamentally say to the state and the cities and counties that when you're planning for for homelessness, you must include domestic violence survivors and unaccompanied women experiencing homelessness in your goal setting, in your plans, in what you are attempting to do. Because we know if you aren't tracking a particular population, you're not targeting solutions at what they need.
I like the people I know who say that the solutions and the problem exist in the same place. Coming to you, Yenni, on this, your experience of domestic violence, which led you to a kind of homelessness, started with you having a very good job at Marriott. Is that right? Tell us what happened.
I was a sales manager with Marriott. So worked for the Fortune 500 company. I had a career. I was 8 years there. But something that I want to kind of connect with what we just said is that people don't realize that when you leave a domestic violent scenario, you're automatically homeless. You don't have at home the moment you step out that door or step out of that relationship. And so for my case, even though I had a career, I had a great job, I had a bank account, I had to leave it all behind because of my safety. And unfortunately, in California, which is fortunate or not, but whatever you possess, they also possess. It's a communal, state. So therefore, my bank account, yes, my bank account was their bank account. My vehicle was his vehicle. So even though I went to the police with bruises, with a broken lip, to kind of obtain my vehicle back, they let me know, fortunately, he is your spouse, he is your husband, so that is his vehicle. Even though it was under my registration, even though I was the one paying, my bank account was the same way. He was able to empty it at one moment as punishment. So when I walked out that door, I had not even a quarter to my name and a 9-month-old baby.
You said that he emptied your bank account, he took the car. What were you left with?
Nothing. Basically, the clothing I was able to save, when I called my family, my mom, my parents, they were able to just go to markets and try to get carton boxes. And so whatever we're able to get, even all of my documents I wasn't able to obtain, but whatever I was able to rescue, of course, my furniture, everything stayed. So this reminds you once again that you don't end up with zero. You end up with negative because now you're borrowing money, especially once you have a baby. How do you get formula? How do you get diapers? How do you get clothing? Babies grow month to month. And so month to month, you're changing, clothing usually is 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, you don't have nothing at all.
Now, you mentioned that you stayed with your parents, your mother. Would you then have shown up in homeless data?
So I didn't stay with my mom originally. When I went to seek services, I was able to get an emergency restraining order through the police department, which is something I didn't know about. And I learned when I made the police report. And then they were the ones that advised me to go to DPSS, Department of Social Services, and seek help. At that moment, they would give 6 weeks of motel vouchers. At this current moment in 2024, it's only 2 weeks they're able to give. But when I went through it, it was 6 weeks. So that's how I was connected to a shelter. It was through motel vouchers because there was no DV shelter that had a vacancy. And there was even a regular shelter that had a vacancy in LA County. There was nothing they could match me with at the moment. So at least I was able to get connected to motel voucher for 6 weeks. And when the 6 was going up and I had nowhere to go, is when my mom said, no, you can't stay here. She saw how the area was. It wasn't the most productive area. There was a lot of things going underground, narcotics, things like that, with a baby. And so she took me in. I was able to stay in their living room, in their sofa. Me and my baby would sleep in the sofa. At least we had a roof to be able to survive because there was no shelter opening at that time. And because I hadn't yet gotten my childcare subsidy through DPSS, there was a waiting list for childcare subsidy. I ended up having to wait 9 months.
And that same question again then, and when a person is living with their mom or relative or friend on their couch, do they show up in homelessness statistics? Are they counted as homeless?
Good question. Unfortunately, the HUD definition says that somebody who's doubled up or staying or couch surfing is not considered homeless anymore. Even if you're staying in somebody's floor, at somebody's kitchen, you're not considered homeless at the moment. Only for the education system are you considered. So I'm glad that at least they were considered homeless because at least my child was able to get support the moment he started preschool. We were able to get coats and backpacks and things like that, utensils that he would qualify as the low income and homeless child. But for HUD services, I was never able to get my own apartment. So I had to end up saving. It took me years because first I had to save for being able to get a vehicle, to then get to my employment, to then get an apartment. So it took me 5 years to be able to get out of that.
What a rigmarole. I'm so sorry you went through that, Yenni. Teniecka, coming to you, you were an Air Force veteran. Are there special situations that veterans find themselves in regarding domestic violence and surviving?
Yes, actually, it's a little bit complicated because when I was fleeing from my situation, I had 4 kids. I had an 8, a 7, a 6, and a 3-year-old. And when you go to the VA and you're going for your doctor's appointments and they're trying to ask you, is anything wrong? Are you being harmed? If I say yes, they're also mandatory reporters. That puts me in a very awkward position to say, oh, yes, there's something wrong. So I would never tell them that. So when I was fleeing, I did find help and assistance from Rainbow Services. But because they are mandatory reporters, they do have to go ahead and do the proper protocol by calling and letting DCFS know. Even though I've left the situation, they kind of have to check and make sure that there's no connection with the father or any of that. So, and
Teniecka, just to clarify for people, the Family Protective Services, often seen as family policing strategies, particularly come down hard disproportionately on women of color, African American women specifically. So you were afraid of losing your kids if you said there was violence in the home.
Very correct. That was 100%. You're absolutely 100% correct. Because although I did the correct thing to leave the situation, now on the opposite spectrum, I'm putting my kids in harm's way because now I'm homeless. Now you're not protecting them correctly. So now you're also being watched by the state. Like, how are you taking care of your kids adequately when you don't have housing? You can't. So then I had to be very careful as when I'm maneuvering, when I was fleeing, to make sure I'm doing everything in my power, because I was staying with my family as well. But there was 5 of us, and that's a lot on my family. So I had to go into a transitional facility and actually be deemed homeless because, like Yenni said, you're not considered homeless when you're with family.
So coming back to you, Krista, on policy, and I want everyone to talk about this too, clearly we need data to be a bit more comprehensive, perhaps a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more curious. With respect to understanding what services people need, you talked about the bill that provided some resources for services. When you suggested what it is that could keep victims of domestic violence off the streets, what did you prioritize? And what do you prioritize in terms of services?
Sure. I think for survivors, it's a whole range of services, right? Domestic violence impacts every component of a survivor's life. And I really want to appreciate Yenni and Teniecka for sharing your stories. Unfortunately, the experiences you shared are ones we hear echoed by survivors all across the state every single day. And there's so much to be done. And, on the point of data, one thing I want to name is that domestic violence service providers already collect and provide a tremendous amount of data. And since there was conversation about, shelters being full, I want to just name for the domestic violence emergency shelters here in California in 2021 to 22, which is the last year we have published data, they provided emergency shelter to over 13,000 individuals for a total of more than 354,000 nights. But at the same time, in that same year, there were over 15,000 unmet requests for shelter. The demand is so high on these shelter services, right? And unfortunately, Yenni, that experience of calling shelters and them being full is one that is a struggle. And so when we think about what services are needing, housing is essential, but not just emergency shelter, longer term housing, right? Transitional housing, which Teniecka mentioned, that can provide several years of stable housing along with a range of services, and also a housing first approach that provides rapid rehousing for folks who may already be experiencing homelessness, or housing stabilization for folks who are housed but at risk of losing their housing. And that is flexible to accommodate that range of needs that a survivor might need to be able to establish permanent housing, which could be help with a security deposit, which is not cheap here in California with our rent prices where they are. Could be help with an employment and job training program or completing a college degree so that you can earn a higher wage. Can be help with car repair so that you can get to and from work and sit in LA traffic and commute to your job to, get paid to be able to pay your rent. That whole range of needs. And that's just the housing spectrum.
So first you need data, then you need some input on policy. Teniecka, coming to you, do you think survivors themselves have adequate input into the policy that's being promoted and potentially passed?
Not always. If you're not part of a cohort, as I'm an advocate, so I get to be a part of more than if I was just a survivor just going through it or just a victim of that, you don't really get to really share about what's going on, especially if you're fleeing. You don't really have the input on these different things. I know for myself, one of the things that is key is when you're doing these policy things, it's kind of bridging the gap between the nonprofits and other organizations coming together, collaboratively working, because it's hard to find things because there's so many different systems, different layers, and you can't break through all of them. And if they're not working together, that makes it even more hard and more strenuous on you trying to find the services and trying for those partners to work together.
Now, Yenni, Los Angeles seems to be pretty special in having a cohort, as Teniecka just mentioned, working together. How did that come about, and what do you see it accomplishing? Yenni?
So I think, like Teniecka was sharing, it's breaking the silos. I think we've come to a long way where we realize that we need to educate each other about our systems. There is a homeless system, there is a DV system, there is education, there is childcare system. They each have their own protocols. They each have their own bills that get passed. They each need to be working with each other. And that's the purpose of the cohort, to be able to sit at the table together, to be able to look at bills together, to be able to initiate bills, because not only about what is on the table, but also, hey, what doesn't exist that we need to create, something that Krista was sharing. Like Teniecka says, if we don't get involved, we don't advocate, changes don't come about, because we are the faces of the survivors. And many of us survivors, it did take a while before we were able to speak and share our stories because we're in hiding. So I think that's the burden that me and Teniecka kind of share, along with Krista, is making sure that as a cohort, we sit at the table. We look at what doesn't exist that can exist. For example, my story 5-6 years ago along the line now was able to help to get rid of family fees for childcare subsidy. And that will help future family surviving DV to be able to get childcare and then continue working, just like Krista was sharing, just like Teniecka was sharing, that it does make an impact when we all speak to each other. We don't only see at numbers, the data, but we also sit at the table and said, what bills can we support? What bills can we make sure that our survivors call their council members and urge them, and call their senators and urge them. Maybe use social media, for example. That's a great way to advocate. Use social media to make sure, make awareness to a community what bills are on the table, but also understanding each other's systems. Something that we at LAHSA, that I'm proud to do in my work, is actually one of my colleagues comes from Rainbow. And she helped pass this exact bill. She was part of that team. So then now she's at LAHSA, and we were able to then improve our referral system. So those families that are surviving DV, how do they refer? We changed it so that those referrals can be seen as urgent, something that didn't exist before we came to the table. And that's what the cohort's trying to do.
I mean, it seems like it shouldn't be rocket science, but it is really unique. It seems to be unique what you're doing in Los Angeles. Coming back to you, Krista, this cohort that we keep hearing about, who's in it? How did it come about? What is it?
Yeah, so at the state level, there's a cohort called the Home Cohort, which is a shorthand for Housing Opportunities Mean Everything. And it brings together 11 organizations from all across the state. So Rainbow Services from Los Angeles, we have folks from Orange County, we have culturally specific programs also from Los Angeles and other parts of the state. We have Bay Area participation, the Central Valley, and the far north of the state. Folks outside of California sometimes forget that California is a deeply rural state in many areas. And one of the things that I find so special about the Home Cohort is that it brings together folks from all of those perspectives who are doing such important and hard work in their communities. And the challenges, even in deeply urban Los Angeles to, the Central Valley and the rural far north, may look a little different in terms of complexity and scope, but fundamentally the lack of housing for survivors and the struggles of survivors navigating the homelessness system is a commonality shared all across the state. So it's bringing folks together to work on shared solutions. They've produced toolkits to help support the entire domestic violence field in doing this work. They've produced a whole series of webinars on the issue. They've produced tools for survivors to know their rights in housing when they're renting, all sorts of really incredible work that's designed to lift up the realities of the day-to-day to some larger system change.
Right, so I hate to go from this high point of enthusiasm about new data collection, new input, and new policy making from a new cohort. But then when we get to the implementation stage, money is required. And as I said at the top, the federal funding that comes from the Crime Victims Act, VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, is due to be slashed by 45%. What will that do to the services available to people in California, starting with you, Teniecka? What do you think? What do you fear?
I fear that more of the women will go back to their abusers, not wanting to stay away and try to become self-sufficient, because when the funding is limited, you can't do a lot. You can't help. You can't provide the resources because there's no funding to do so. So I really do fear that people will go back, and that's scary because there's also the scary part of that person not coming out of that and ultimately losing their life. So I don't like that's happening. And that is such a very important thing that we need. Funding is so important and vital to the resources that all survivors and victims need in order to sustain self-sufficiency, be independent, and be able to come out of those situations and never have to return.
I mean, as you said, this is personal for you. Rainbow Services helped you. How soon you work there now? How soon before you think there would be an impact on the kind of services your organization could provide? If this cut goes through, I think it's scheduled for July of this year, 24.
I'm not really certain how soon, and I don't want to put a real year on that, because it does seem like it's up and down and it fluctuates. So I would just have to wait and see, and hopefully those that are in the positions to make the choices and the decisions would see that that's not a good way to go, and that they would reconsider and extend that federal funding for all that had been provided and continues to be provided for the work out there for the survivors and the victims of the situation.
Krista, is this a done deal? This cut for the federal VOCA Act?
Victims of Crime Act. Yes and no. At the federal level, yes. Congress finalized their spending bills in March, and the dollar amount included for VOCA is lower than we have seen in years and years, and has been on a steady decline since 2019. These funds are not traditional taxpayer dollars. They're fines and penalties from federal prosecutions that go into a special fund. And the balance has been dropping, and therefore Congress has been dropping how much they release. Congress has also made an intentional choice not to supplement that from a different funding source or find a different option. But as of today, when we're taping, the state's budget process isn't done, and the state still has an opportunity to step in for California and provide the funding that is needed. The state agency that administers these funds out to programs like Rainbow and over 380 other organizations has said that without an infusion of new money beginning in the fiscal year that starts July 1, programs will see a nearly 45% cut to their Victims of Crime Act grant dollars. And just to name what that means, because that's a lot of acronyms and funding sources. Here in domestic violence space, although VOCA is much broader and funds a wider range of crimes, here in domestic violence in California, the Victims of Crime Act dollars are half of the money that goes out to fund the emergency shelters and the 24/7 crisis lines. It's 100% of the money that goes to our transitional housing program, and it's 100% of the money for our domestic violence housing first program. It is what underpins the state's response to domestic violence survivors' housing needs, along with so much more. So this is what's at stake here is everything, right? And to what Teniecka said, these are survivors who are experiencing violence, abuse, risk of lethality, who are reaching out for help. And we have an obligation to make sure someone is there to make that call, to provide that safe space when they do. And Rainbow and so many others do amazing work on a shoestring budget already. The reality is, with 45% cuts, you serve fewer people and you can do less.
As if women and people rearing children weren't in the crosshairs already right now, from so many different angles. Yenni, coming to you, you work at with the city of LA under Mayor Karen Bass. There's been a major commitment to house building, building affordable housing. It's never easy. All of the cities across this country, I think, are dealing with it. How do you see these issues coming together in policy? Because I think what I'm hearing is de-siloing is critical at every level. With this question of federal funding for services specifically tied to domestic violence and crime victims so threatened, are there any other sources of funds that could supplement what people need?
So we try to get very creative, but the fact is, like Krista said, we have to really bring attention to what this funding pays for. I think it's connecting the services to the funding and why they exist, because we are limited. Mind you, we just discovered that for the education system, there's 15,000 in 2024. The numbers went up. There's 15,000 homeless children in the school system. And our last count for LA County was 79,000 homeless. We haven't even gotten the 2024 numbers, which we believe are going to go up. So therefore, is trying to get creative and where do we supplement this funding? Measure Age has been another one that's been is going to come to an end. So we have that burden as well. So it's not Measure Age, and Measure Age helped us with flex funds. For example, we could supplement some of those funds to cover for some of these needs for Measure Age. But unfortunately, that one is also coming to an end. So we're trying to look at even philanthropy. We're trying to look at even where can we bring in the numbers that Krista was saying, to the new numbers for the new count, and even DV families or families in general, or DV survivors, to kind of say, no, we need to pass this budget for the state, because at least for the city or county needs to step up, because we do have funding from city specific, we do have funding from county. So we're trying to wear different hats to try to figure out, okay, if federal has been cut, okay, and state, hopefully not, but if it does happen that they do cut in the range of 45%, okay, who do we go to next? County, city, and where those hats and saying, here are the numbers, here's the data, we need this funding or this is going to cease to exist. And there are going to be more Yenni out there and more Tenieckas out there that we're trying to prevent.
Does bringing a gender lens to this situation and this argument, this case, this advocacy that you're doing make a difference? Is it making a difference with legislators, policymakers, maybe other advocates? What do you think, Yenni?
I do believe so. I think I'll go back to what it's in the beginning. I think it's putting that face to the story. I think we in LAHSA especially, we're focusing on providing the qualitative and quantitative data with narrative. And that includes putting a gender to it, because we do know that certain ethnicities are marginalized, but we also know that women in general are marginalized. We do know that they get less funding for brands. We do know that as it is, they get paid less in the workforce. So having that support of the narrative matching the qualitative and quantitative data has really made a difference this whole fiscal year. It really has.
And Teniecka, are you seeing that too? I mean, of course, there's race as well as gender. And then we have the backdrop of the assault on women's reproductive rights. It does seem as if the majority of people in this country are for equality, but it's still seen as somehow a divisive issue to raise questions of women's existence.
Yes, just like both of the ladies have shared, Krista and Yenni, women have so much, like you've just shared, on their plate. and reminding, like Yenni was saying, that women have a lot to already bear, and not having funding to deal with the resources and the collaborative effort, it does make everything 100% harder. And when you have to navigate the homeless system, you have to navigate the system of the city or the federal or the county. If they're not all working together, you can just get so lost, so overwhelmed, so stressed because you don't understand all these different things. You're just trying to get help. You're just trying to get your family taken care of. You're just trying to take care of yourself and save your own life. But you have to navigate all these things. And then when you go to get help, there's no funding. You can't. Well, I'm a woman trying to get help. Sorry, we don't have the funding for you. So what do you do then? You're back to square one, homeless, trying to figure it out in a very vulnerable situation out there on the streets, fighting the elements along with fleeing the situation. It just makes a compounding situation even that more worse and even that more dire.
Now, the Veterans Administration, the VA, federal agency, has sometimes been an agency of improving equality, treatment of women, combating racism, anti-LGBTQ bias. Is the VA doing any better at any of this or worse?
Well, I could say when I first fled in 2016, what they have in place now, which they didn't have anything about domestic violence at all. They didn't have social workers that dealt with that specifically. Now they do. So definitely things have progressed. Things are changing. They're kind of slower to move as they're federal government. They're slower to move. But as I go into the VAs, I see there's a social worker. They are now putting out the literature. Now, if you do have a situation, now you can talk to someone without always having that in the back of your mind. Are you going to mandatory report and then take my kid and then do all these things that I had in my head? Because like you guys do not have anybody that represents any of that understanding of what I'm dealing with. So how can you actually help me navigate the process?
Going back to this idea that the solution and the problem live in the same place, Krista, what's your message to people in other parts of this country? Because this is a national phenomenon. We're looking at what you're doing in LA and in California, across the state of California. But what's your message to people working in this space, whether it's homelessness or housing or urban development or gender equity or equity? What's your advice here? Because there's kind of so many things playing together. If you were making policy right now, what would be your top 3, tips?
Well, first, I want to give a lot of credit. I learned so much from my peers doing this work across the state. There are so many states that have made tremendous headway here that I look to for inspiration. But I think the common themes, I will say, is including the voices of survivors and advocates. And that for policymakers, if you are not thinking about impact on survivors, when you're thinking about housing and homelessness, if you aren't thinking about survivors, if you aren't thinking about gender, you are missing a huge component of the problem and the potential solutions. And quite honestly, the domestic violence programs I work with every day are so creative and some of the best problem solvers I have ever met. They find the most amazing solutions to help survivors access the resources they need when it feels like there's nothing there. And there is so much all of us, including myself, can continue to learn from advocates on the ground and survivors who get incredibly creative and are so resilient in navigating through their own experiences. So the more we can listen to their voices, the better off all of our work will be.
Teniecka, do you have any top tips for policymakers?
I do have one. It'd be great if they would work together, like Yenni was saying, the narrative. See the person, not just the data. The data is attached to a person. So in order for you to make the proper policies, you need to know who you're affecting, your constituents. You need to know who they are. You need to know what is disturbing them so you can make the proper policies, put them in effect, and not make policies that end up harming instead of helping and not giving a helping hand.
Yenni, I'm going to come to you with a question that we ask all our guests at the end of our programs, and I'll pose it to everybody. If you were to look to the future, 50 years from now, what do you think is the story people there will tell about us in this moment?
I think that I hope that we were part of what helped to build a great system that speaks to each other, that no longer has silos, that encourage a community, encourage neighbors to let go of their bystander syndrome, that encourage community to learn what DV shelters are around them, what numbers to call, that we were part of that message, that advocacy, that this show helped to educate the community and those watching to care for this cause. And therefore, now there is a solution. Now systems talk to each other, but it all began with just this, for example, this show advocating.
Well, that sounds good to me. What do you think, Krista? What's the story the future will tell of now?
You know, I hope that when they look back, they see this moment as unimaginable, that we are living in a future where it is unimaginable that there are nearly 80,000 people in Los Angeles alone who are experiencing homelessness, that so many survivors cannot access the services they need, that so many of our other populations are experiencing homelessness. And I hope that this true crisis moment that we are living in is a springboard for real and lasting change.
And Teniecka?
I would hope that, just like my two ladies out here are sharing with me, that people would look back and say, hey, I have an awareness of domestic violence. Not only am I aware, I'm sensitive to it, and I want to be one that's a changer, a doer, and not just a spectator on the sidelines. So that's the collaboration, the policy, the working together, and the helping of your neighbor one to another.
Tanisha, Krista, Yenni, thank you so much. It's been great having you here with me on Laura Flanders and Friends, and thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to listen to the full conversation from our episode, Domestic Violence Survivor and Homeless 2, A California Cohort Shows What Can Be Done. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join by becoming a member now. Make it a one-time donation or make it monthly. Go to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in the episode notes posted there. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all of our members supporters.